elevate demand for material inputs that are critical to decarbonizing the space. And I think that touches on every component of the energy sector. So we're talking power generation, grid infrastructure, transportation, all of it. We're going to watch demand continue to rise for energy, and with that, we also need to see emissions rapidly decline. So really excited to build out this conversation on what role these inputs, critical minerals, metals, and materials will play in that transition. And really excited to introduce our panelists to have that conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce Mohammed Kiani, the head of MENA Consulting at Rystad, Lee Beck, Senior Director in Europe and the Middle East for the Clean Air Task Force, and Dr. Emre Hatipoglu, who's Research Fellow at CAPSARC, the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Great to have you all with us today, thank you for joining. You know, Kiani, I want to start out by just kind of framing the conversation. Can you provide us with a sense of the scale of demand for these inputs and the minerals and materials that will drive the energy transition?
Yes, so first of all, thank you for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to be in front of such a diverse audience. So I think just to give you an idea of demand first, what I would like to show you that the demand of material depends on a wide range of factors. So here, if you see on the screen, some non-exhaustive list of factors that range from sourcing of materials, market imbalance plays an important factor. Now that we see the policies that are influencing the demand of material, and I think very important, and which is increasingly becoming more important, especially in the MENA region, is recycling and the second use of material as well. So these factors play an important role in terms of demand. And just to show you that how the demand is evolving, our estimates, and this is based on our internal scenarios, which is 1.8 degrees centigrade of energy transition. If you see the renewable capacity addition, starting with its capacity will grow to about 1.5 terawatts in 2050, which is about 4-time increase from current 2022 levels. And for battery, it would be even more, about 20x. So we see that the annual capacity will increase significantly until 2050. And how that will impact the material consumption, just to show you an idea of that. So if we look at the material demand from energy transition sectors, and here you can see until 2050 again, based on our 1.8 degree scenario, and you can also see 1.6 degree, there will be a substantial growth reaching about 350 million tons per annum. So that is a significant growth we see, although 5% in terms of compounded growth, but that would be about 4x increase from 2022. And that would have a significant influence on the demand of material. And if we see the CAGR of different components that make this demand, we see that energy storage, batteries, electric vehicles, and road freight would actually have a double-digit growth. On the other hand, solar PV, they would have a little bit less growth than what we would see in more of energy and offshore wind as well. So, and if we move further beyond, I think just to show you that the materials, most materials in the context of energy transition, you can see non-metals and metals as well. So like non-metals would definitely, they have a higher global production and more market value. But if we see metals starting with iron and steel and going to lithium, they would have also a large market value. And you can see that the relevance to clean energy technologies, solar, wind, batteries, they hold a very significant importance and a constituent of these components that we will see going forward. And just to finally, I think, give you an idea again of the battery materials, we estimate that the lithium, especially until 2050, and you can see from 2022 growth multiplied, that would increase 10 times. But overall, each of these materials would have a significant growth, cobalt, graphite, but at the same time, if you see on the right-hand side, rare earth metals and manganese. So all in all, I would say the energy transition would have a significant impact on demand going forward. And this, of course, again, depends on the energy transition scenario. So if you have 1.6, you will have a higher demand of materials that would be expected.
So Dr. Emre, Kiani points to obviously a massive diversified growth within the materials sector, and I think he started off with the multifaceted dimensions of what's going to impact the material transition. I want to build on that and think about the changing contours of the supply chain overall. Critical minerals, materials in the supply chain, I think will look fundamentally different going forward, especially geopolitically, than our contemporary supply chains. Could you give us a little bit of an overview on some of the key differences and the contours of where the supply chain is and where it's headed?
Thank you, indeed. First of all, thank you for having me. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be among this distinguished panel, as well as speaking to the select audience. This is a topic that my colleagues and I have been thinking for a long time. When Daniel Yergin released his book, The New Map, he had this analogy called, shall we move from big oil to big shovels? And since then, I've been thinking, whether and in what ways shovels are different from oil when it comes to supply chain issues regarding energy. Now, the advantage of critical minerals, in a nutshell, what I'm going to say in the next few minutes, is that it replicates some of the conventional geopolitical challenges. Not everything is new. But it also brings in some new geopolitical challenges that the current institutions and our current way of understanding international relations do not necessarily answer for. So we should be cognizant of both. So here's my very quick treat. Now, if we had to set the stage, actually the problem is quite simple. For importers of critical minerals, strategies revolve around mitigating supply chain vulnerabilities, de-risking, decoupling, take your saying of the day. While meanwhile, for mineral-rich countries, the aim is to maximize the benefits from their mineral wealth. It could be either selling these ores at the highest price possible or integrating down the value chain, so to get even more and sustained revenues over a longer time period. Well, of course, occasionally these strategies clash and bring geopolitical and economic tensions. We have observed many of these recently. The OECD governments, many of them have undertook a lot of fiscal policies to somehow nearshore or onshore or otherwise strengthen their critical mineral supply chain sources, such as the critical mineral provisions of the US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, the Australia's Critical Minerals Strategy, or the EU's Raw Materials and Critical Minerals Act, among others. But in doing so, it's also important to notice that these countries have, to varying degrees, have invoked some sort of a national security discourse and securitized these supply chains, which may eventually will create, which I'll touch upon, interesting geopolitical tensions that we need to be aware of. Meanwhile, supplier countries also have started increasing more and more export bans, as well as different export restrictions. A recent OECD report stated that the number of export restrictions, individual export restrictions on critical minerals, increased more than 5 times over the past several years, and most of these export restrictions came from the global south. So I think you can see where these interests have started, clashing with each other. But one more small wrinkle to the story. While these materials are critical, they are not likely to be cartelized, because we are not speaking of one critical mineral. There is a plethora of what those critical minerals are, and the definition of these lists or the compilation of these lists change also every single year. So the recent USGS, United States Geological Survey, actually, striked away about 5 or 6 minerals and brought in 3 or 4 new ones. So these things change over time. As well as there's high demand elasticity for these markets to be cartelized. Nonetheless, we still see market dominance being leveraged in geopolitics when it comes to critical minerals. The famous story that we always start is in 2010 when China leveraged their rare earth magnets against Japan due to certain problems in the Pacific. But then we also see Russia playing this game with nickel, among other things. And we are now also seeing other things coming to play as well. But I'm going to say a little bit more just in a couple of minutes. But these are also what we see is sometimes seems to be one-off uses. And what we are, and we're very early in this, but what we're seeing right now is these seem to be not, the countries may not necessarily employ these geopolitical leverage over time, because the market somehow finds a way to replace or somehow adjust to these disruptions. At least that's what we've been for the time being. And also, it's also important that a lot of the rare earth elements are not necessarily rare. It's whether the country is willing to incur the social and the environmental externalities, and then bring it on as a some sort of a cheap enough option to global markets. Now, I want to highlight 3 ways in which critical minerals differ geopolitically when critical minerals and supply chains in critical minerals differ from our conventional understanding of supply chain geopolitics. The first one is critical minerals, as I briefly alluded to, implies many, many different critical minerals, and each of them suggests a different geopolitical relationship. To illustrate, just think about platinum, all right? If you are really investing in hydrogen, platinum is something that's very critical to your plants. Why? Because it is critical to what we call proton exchange membranes when you're producing hydrogen fuel cells. And I think it was Commerzbank that said that the demand in hydrogen, platinum due to production of hydrogen is expected to grow from 48,000 ounces to 2.7 million ounces by 2030. So if you're talking about the hydrogen story, and now you're going into platinum, which brings South Africa into play, which is a totally different story than when you make your typical lithium processing story with respect to Latin America and China, for that matter. Another example is gallium. Gallium mostly is derived through processing of bauxite towards aluminum. And so if you are talking about a gallium story here, you're talking about the story of bauxite and aluminum, which is a totally different supply chain story. So one size does not fit you all, and I cannot prime you enough for this issue. Second thing is the role of sub-state/local governments in critical minerals. So when you switch the perspective from this grandiose, state-centric, realist understanding to how sub-state actors interact with each other, you develop a better understanding of geopolitics of critical mineral supply chains work. And we have a lot of proof towards that point. Sub-state governments, and especially city and regional level governments, play an increasingly important role in establishing resilient value chains. And this is not surprising because official permitting requirements or the social license to operate for these critical minerals inevitably involve local politics involvement. And in a lot of polities, in a lot of countries, these local politics also feed into national politics. So when you're engaging in geopolitics of critical minerals, coming from an importer's perspective, and put it that way, you would be ignoring local politics at your own peril. And research showed this increasing, so innovation a lot of time comes from that too. A professor from Johns Hopkins University, Jonas Nam, recently published a book called Collaborative Advantage, where he talks that a lot of the innovative thrust in renewables comes from local level innovation in China, as well as in Germany and United States. So local governments, the role they play in supply chains of critical minerals is what more than meets the eye. And not surprisingly, the federal US government has been supporting a lot of city-level initiatives, the most recent of which has been the Western Hemisphere City Partnership, in which one of their main areas of expertise and main areas of focus is actually how to secure critical mineral inputs for the Western Hemisphere, but percolating this strategy through city-level engagement. So I think that's something we're kind of missing. My final point is also what I'm going to call, it's going to sound pretentious, but just try to get what I'm trying to say here, because I'm not an economist, so the economists can make fun of me right now. Some concept of technological elasticity and substitutable of critical minerals. We are still quite early in the innovation cycles for many critical minerals. I mean, surely valuable research at the laboratories and elsewhere has been going on how to extract and process these materials, but the eye of the Sauron, so to speak, has just started turning on the critical minerals markets as the hiking commodity prices made raw materials a key cost in clean energy technologies. So what we are seeing right now is, as innovations in critical minerals is no longer random innovation shocks that come out of a university or a lab out there, but it's increasingly market-driven. So you have a problem with cobalt, you see more and more, you see more and more batteries that are using, they are not using cobalt, LFPs and other options out there. Or a similar dynamic is now arguably can be made for graphite, where you have synthetic versus natural graphite, and the market is investing in these less vulnerable supply chains as a response. And we are too early in, I think, in the innovation cycle right now to project what will be geopolitically vulnerable 15 years down the road, because we don't know where innovation will really take us. And every single step, when I open Factiva or Bloomberg and I check the news, I see a new innovation coming about, and this could be the game changer. So actually, I also point out to a recently released Atlantic Council report on alternative battery chemistries and battery technologies, which kind of makes similar arguments. So these are a little bit different from conventional hydrocarbon supply chains. I mean, surely sanctions and other forms of supply crises have led to a restructuring of oil markets. And remind you, we're in the 50th year of the OPEC oil embargo, or OAPEC oil embargo in 1973. But still, the oil suppliers remained central in these oil markets. I am not sure whether innovation can make those suppliers that rely too much on their monopoly or oligopoly in this market to sustain their lead and have the market not respond to them structurally in the longer term. So I think these are the three important points how supply chains differ in critical minerals with respect to geopolitics.
I think the call on that agility to be able to respond is really interesting. Historically, when you're looking at forecasts and building and meeting a net zero future, there was always a degree of latitude for innovation. And I think in contemporary scenarios, there's an increasing call on having to provide an input that doesn't allow for innovation. So we force ourselves to fill gaps, with hydrogen, with something else. And your narrative there on cobalt, being replaced by other battery chemistries and nickel and whatnot is I think really salient. Also really appreciate bringing this holistic picture to the conversation around these supply chains, because I think, in many ways it reflects the energy trilemma. Again, we're talking about economics, we're talking about security, but Lee, we also are at MENA Climate Week, and we need to talk about sustainability, and the changing contours of the supply chain are equally important when we talk about the requirements to meet net zero. We often think about the energy transition for critical materials and often gravitate towards critical minerals, but obviously minerals, metals, materials, the composites of the future. I mean, this is a really diverse community of inputs. And I want to break that down a little bit and hear your thoughts, about the materials being produced, the role of carbon capture and CCUS in particular, and how we should be looking at this space from a sustainability and climate lens as well.
Yeah, thanks, Landon. Thanks for having me on this panel here. And I'd also like to thank our fantastic hosts, the UNFCCC and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's really an honor to be in this incredible space. My name is Lee Beck. I work for the Clean Air Task Force. For those of you who don't know us, we're a global climate organization focusing on overlooked solutions and clean energy infrastructure in the US, Europe, in the Middle East, and Africa. And I think my colleagues already on the panel and you, Landon, put it really, really well. We're looking at a new system of inputs for a new energy system. And to really sum it up, what we've heard so far, it's new trade-offs, new dependencies, new vulnerabilities. And so I think from a scale perspective, what I get a little bit nervous about in these conversations is, right, we have 80% of global emissions are covered by net zero targets, by really lofty targets, ambitious targets, particularly for scaling next generation tech, but also renewables, and very little kind of thought goes into, is it really feasible? Is it really scalable? And I think what we've heard already on this panel is we're looking at a different range of materials and critical minerals from the current system. I think in a net zero compliance scenario, the demand for aluminum is 9 times as much as in a fossil fuel-based system, for example. We're also looking at a different scale and scale up really, really fast. I think 2030 targets with the lead times that we're looking at, particularly for mining and supply chain, is really complicated. And we're looking at all of this in a new fragmented global geopolitical system where, of course, industrial policy was the key response over the past 3 years, but there's key questions, right? I think for Europe, thinking about the biggest energy importer in the world and wanting with the Net Zero Industry Act to look at 40% of manufacturing capacity for deployment of clean tech in 2030, that's only 40%. So you need to create new supply chains that hopefully don't imitate the dependencies and the risks in other energy supply chains that Europe has seen before, and you need to create a new system of strategic alliances around this. So I think there's a huge question that I hope we can get into in this panel, what the region can do in terms of partnerships, particularly with Europe and other markets. But I also want to just go over a few, before I hand it back to you, Landon, a few things I think that are really important to recognize about minerals and materials. For one, there's a very different geographic concentration, you already talked about this, than fossil fuel resources. It's way more concentrated. The other piece is this longer project lead times, right? It takes, I think, 16.5 years on average to move mining projects, according to the International Energy Agency. And then you also have declining resource quality already today, and we haven't really even gotten to scale yet. So, for example, I think in this IEA report, it also said that the average copper ore grade in Chile has declined over 30% over the past 15 years, right? And we haven't really gotten started. And then there is the vulnerability of the system overall, and that's the impact from climate change risk on supply chains globally. So I think there is a few aspects and risks that we haven't really understood that we might not be able to solve over the next 7 years as we're thinking about 2030 targets. And then CCUS, I think, is an interesting, carbon capture and storage is an interesting aspect to bring into this conversation because we saw in the slides, we're going to have a lot of demand for cement and steel to be the backbone of clean energy technologies, particularly renewables. Carbon capture and storage is vital for this, for sure. I think another important piece is aluminum. I talked about this earlier. 75% of emissions are from electricity, so really thinking about 24/7, 365 clean electricity in a grid that is probably 3 to 4 times as big as it is today. And baseload power really requires a range of clean energy options beyond renewables, particularly nuclear and also carbon capture and storage on power plants. And so I think the final question is carbon capture and utilization as where CO2 becomes a feedstock, particularly for fuels. Again, it's energy intensive. It depends on life cycle emissions. But I think there's a range of opportunities, particularly in industrial places that don't have access to geologic storage. So I'll stop here, but I'm really excited for this conversation.
No, Lee, I think, you bring up some, I think, incredible opportunities and some very sizable challenges, not least just the scale of the transition that we're looking to undertake. But I do want to spend some time deep diving what that means for the region. When I look at the long lead times, for example, in the context of mining operations and the upstream side of these value chains, I think about a region that's not bashful about taking on big projects and thinking about very strategically about the investments that are underpinning the future of the energy system. So I want to go back to you, Kiani, and kind of start thinking through the role of the MENA region in the future supply chain and its role in integration with this material transition.
So thank you very much. So I think it's very important that MENA region, especially as they have these net zero targets as well. So make sure that they have a robust and reliable supply chain that can provide them with the resources that they require. So one thing that you mentioned that across different industries they are trying to decarbonize, and we see increasingly that especially the GCC countries have taken a lead. So just to uh, just to show you some of the examples. So here, if you see a selection of projects that they have been working on, so in steel production, so a lot of countries are using new technologies that can reduce the carbon emissions. So, for instance, using electric arc furnaces, DRIs as well. Similarly, in aluminium production, UAE actually has the EGA, which is one of the largest aluminium producer in the region, has developed solar power aluminium smelting projects, and similarly carbon capture and storage. So I think as my colleague mentioned, that it has a lot of potential, and in UAE again we see that they have one of the largest commercial CCUS. We see that they have one of the largest commercial CCUS project, about 10 MTPA 2030 target for CCUS. Similarly, hydrogen as well. So there's a lot of traction in green hydrogen. I was just at the talk of NEOM, and it was very interesting to hear their ambitions. Similarly, UAE again has very ambitious plans, Oman as well. So they are making a lot of progress in making sure that they're able to reduce the carbon emissions. Similarly, energy efficiency, which again is very important, and circular economy, the recycling and making sure that you are able to reduce the waste that comes from it. And lastly, I think very importantly is other regulations. So we see now in the region there is not a regulation for such as carbon, but now they're introducing. So UAE set up carbon trading, which is in the process of being set up. Similarly, I think Saudi Arabia is also working on that. So there are a lot of traction and initiatives that are going through that would make sure that they're able to decarbonize their operation, and making sure that making the supply chain more robust and resilient, especially if they want to reach the net zero targets that they have produced. Especially, I think also it would lead to significant economic benefits. So the diversification from oil and gas, which is a very important goal for GCC countries as well. So again, that would open up a new line of economic streams that could really benefit these oil-dependent countries as well. So, so I think these are, and again, I think if we look at, and if you're just looking at a selection of GCC countries, so Saudi Arabia, it again has one of the largest phosphate reserves, so it is committed to enhancing its lithium and cobalt resources. As I mentioned before, green hydrogen, renewable power as well. And SABIC is also in the process of developing the largest CCU plant. So with applications, urea, methanol, liquid carbon dioxide. UAE I mentioned already, but I think it's very important to mention that Masdar and ADNOC have set very ambitious targets. So that were one of the largest probably from countries I've heard, 100 gigawatts of renewable capacity and 10 MTP of green hydrogen by 2030. So, and they are actively working to make sure that they achieve these targets. And as I said before, they're not only operating within the confines of the country, but they're doing it globally as well. So they're going ahead, investing in other countries as well. So making sure that it develops the decarbonization agendas as well. Similarly, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, all of them have very rich resources of minerals that they are, and at the same time they're making sure that they're able to process and extract them in an efficient carbon. I would not say, but less carbon intensive way. So they are making steady progress, and I believe that there is room to grow, but at the same time, these small steps can lead to a greater progress.
You know, you articulate a really good picture in terms of the region identifying an opportunity space and beginning to seize it,
Yes.
and frankly, quite a diversified opportunity space. Dr. Emre, if I can turn to you, though, in building on this outlook, you know, the Atlantic Council has a perspective from Washington, D.C. of, you know, what is the United States doing with its partners and allies to build out a inclusive energy system and energy transition. That's my center. You're at CAPSARC, you're a sister organization of ours, and I think you're looking very much from the similar lens of this region and how it builds on this. Obviously, there's work being done. What does the opportunity space now look like going forward?
Sure. And I think in answering this question, thank you very much, Lee, Mohammed, and Landon. You really set the stage, at least the technical background and what's on the field. So let me just abstract it just a level up, because I think that's where we can do that, given your question. How can, you know, MENA can contribute to global value chains, and where we can really bring in a lot of value is not only supplying the technology or the ores over there, but also take some leadership with respect to business processes. And we have been doing that. We started with the circular carbon economy approach. And what we're doing is we're also investing a lot in the region to other companies around the region as well as around the world, and making sure that this, you know, circular approach really, you know, creates its impact throughout, you know, global value chains. In the shorter region, again, if you want to Google just, you know, what we're doing right now in Egypt, you know, current Saudi-Egypt partnership with respect to, you know, low carbon, hydrogen-based, as well as electricity trade, that also enables both countries' grids to work, you know, much better, and, you know, to produce low carbon associated aluminum as well as cement and other things. So there is the capacity building component that the GCC and Saudi Arabia in particular is very much interested in around its trading partners. And I think that's where the US and Saudi Arabia is really working, at least their strategies converge. There is another thing that I think we're not discussing as much, which is the Saudi affairs and digitalization. And when you look at the, you know, especially the EU documents, but as well as some of the American documents, there is this undercurrent, or there is this theme of, you know, we are not imposing any digital template, but the more transparent you are with respect to your associated carbons or associated your energy profiles, the more we're open to trading. And a lot of the, you know, Saudi efforts that the, you know, region can benefit from is our digitalization attempts with respect to our industry and our services. I think that's something that we can really be cognizant of. But also, you know, as I told you, PIF is also investing in the field elsewhere around the world. You know, we have signed a lot of agreements with a lot of partners elsewhere. This is beyond the domestic capacity that Mohammed talked about. But I'm going to bring another dimension, if I may, which is recycling. So here's an interesting opportunity for our region here, and I think that's really what speaks to all this global effort. Because at the end of the day, whatever report you read, it should be all hands on deck. And recycling is not a less important, not a least like part of it. But I think we're standing as a unique moment here, where this recycling concept could really, you know, be utilized and seized by the GCC and Saudi Arabia to, you know, project further leadership in critical minerals. Why is that? Well, you know, as you said, there are 17 years. There are reports from 5 to 6 to 17, you know, depending on who you are talking, Glencore, Rio, you know, and whatnot. But the beautiful thing about recycling is it gives you a much lesser time frame of bringing these critical minerals to the market. And just to give you an idea, some of the US report says that, you know, US should pretty much derive its 10% of its critical minerals in about a decade or so. So that's about, you know, that's a big market. And what's interesting is that, you know, when you think about Saudi Arabia and when you think about oil, we think about spare capacity, we think about, you know, smoothing out the markets. We think about, you know, providing the world with sufficient energy so that the world runs its business. And we can do that by investing a lot in recycling capacity too. Recycling is very energy intensive, but it turns out that we have a lot of green and blue and carbon sequestered energy that we can utilize here. If you want to scale it globally, you have to be pretty much the logistical center to bring all these waste products here to recycle. But it so happens that we're also investing due to our Vision 2030 strategy to connect East and West and North and South logistically. So that investment is already out there. So a lot of the planets are right now aligning for us to really bring recycling into this and, somehow help, this region to lead in terms of critical mineral recycling and therefore contribute to supply chain, resilience. Now, of course, it's not that easy because, again, recycling starts the moment you start producing something at the outset. Just to put it in very rough terms, if you put metals or critical metals too much into plastic, it becomes unrecyclable, right? So maybe you have to engage in regulatory bodies at the outset, not at the end, but at the outset, so that you have a say in how these products are designed, how these, logistical, relations are established. But if you can do that, and if you can keep your good relations both for the East and the West, I think we can emerge as a recycling center and add further resilience, which I think is very much in line, back to your question, with Western and US interests of keeping resilient and decentralized and de-risked or decoupled critical mineral value chains. So I think that's something that we're not talking sufficiently as critical minerals experts in the field, but I think it is time that we evaluate that option more seriously right now. So.
All right, because you brought up the idea, I'm going to stick with you, though, for a second.
Sure.
This idea of recycling, in some ways, you're talking about centrality of this process in the region. And, I mean, the Middle East is very central to the global economy, and there's a logic in that. But, you kicked off by talking about the geopolitical facets of this, and, frankly, the interests of many economies on pushing themselves further into the value chain. You certainly see that in the bilateral engagement that the United States has with many African countries on supplies and moving from, as opposed to just a extraction phase, to a refining and processing phase as well, and giving value add to these economies. How do you think that kind of proposal would be received globally? And how do you navigate the contours of a problem set that's global in nature and a market that's global in nature when you're trying to bring something here to the MENA region?
I think you are just identified a main important challenge. Let me revert back to one of the points when I said, we should, when think about geopolitics, we should think about also non-state actors. And one of them are businesses, companies. Some of the successes right now are successes because you don't hear about them. So when Indonesia progressively prohibited its nickel ore exports, but rather with the aim of, kind of developing this ore to battery technology, it could have been much more controversial. But a lot of the Western companies, including Volkswagen, Tesla, LG, the Korean LG, they played game and they invested in a very, very productive way in Indonesia. And instead of this becoming a geopolitical tension, it became a nice value creation center in Indonesia where everybody is a stakeholder and where all parties are actually better off. I think there is some learning points there for us here in the region too. And I think PIF and other innovative Saudi companies have been investing a lot, not only in critical minerals, but other aspects of renewable energy. Alphenar comes to mind, for instance, right now. And I think we are also developing similar examples when it responds, letting businesses take the lead initially and create value out of these value chains. But in doing so, making sure that all interested parties are happy with the product so that we are converging upon a much more mutually beneficial and mutually value-creating future. I think we have a lot of examples, but the key is those are the examples that you don't hear about because they're successes. Right. Hence, they don't become issues of tension or contention.
So, Lee, building on this idea of regional integration, but thinking through how the rest of the world can engage with MENA on the materials transition. The United States and Europe in particular with some partners in Asia have set up partnerships, minerals partnerships, security partnerships around just addressing these supply chains. I think curious to see your perspective coming out of Brussels with extensive time also in Washington, D.C. How do we engage globally, both directions? How does the Middle East engage Western counterparts, and how does Washington and Brussels engage this region, not just on minerals, but I think in the holistic aspect of of the material transition.
Yeah, thanks, Landon. I do want to, before I go into this, double down on the recycling, because I think one thing that we have not acknowledged in this panel yet is the different lifetimes of different clean energy resources. Wind and solar, for example, have much shorter decadal lifetimes than, say, nuclear power or other power plants. And so there is a higher turnover of materials that will have to be reprocessed, recycled. And I think this is a big question that has not been figured out or often glossed over. I mean, the additional capacity shows up in the models, but really how do we operationalize this in the real world in a responsible way has not surfaced, in my mind, in the climate conversation. I think from a kind of engagement perspective, I think it's really, the future is really about mutually beneficial partnerships and making sure that we're actually homing into some of the competitive advantages. As I said earlier, there was this notion to move to industrial policy, but for some regions, like Europe, it's actually not feasible. You have limited space, you're the biggest energy importer in the world, you have limited ability to vastly build new clean energy infrastructure and manufacturing, and you also have actually limited capital, limited fiscal ability to maneuver, especially after the energy crisis last year and the pressure that governments came under to buy down the price of energy. And, you know, as part of this, of course, Europe has struggled. Deindustrialization was a big question. So I think there's multiple ways here. On the one hand, of course, the region can invest. There's a lot of capital that is available, and the investments have happened, particularly in energy infrastructure, next generation clean tech in Europe. The other piece is really, you know, and I think this, remembering where we are here today, Saudi Arabia has, of course, laid out its vision for 2030. There have been strategic investments in supply chains globally, particularly for the first time in the global mining industry. There's a kind of flourishing of EV manufacturing. So these are all products that places like Europe will need, and might not be able to produce. And of course, there's abundant, cheap, and clean power here. There's space, again, there's capital. So I think it's really about creating flexible partnerships for the future. And what I think is important is really homing into long-term reliability as a partner, as we're moving, I think, away from an age that was mostly driven by multilateralism to one that will be more important in terms of bilateral partnerships and strategy.
So ultimately, this all thematically drives to an aspect of how we actually build transparent, competitive, secure, and of course, sustainable supply chains. And I just want to take, pun intended here a little bit, a stock take of our progress. Thematically for MENA Climate Week is about the stock take. There's a big stock take that'll happen in COP28 in Dubai this December. It's a key component of the UNFCCC process. This is a figurative stock take. And I want to think about the progress we are making in building the capacity for this transition. I want to think about the stock take and the progress we are making in reducing emissions. And I want to take a stock take about our ability to unlock the required capital to enable this transition. So thinking about, I'm going to go to each of you and really dive into this, our capacity building, our emissions reduction, and investment flows to match it. I guess, Kiani, I'll start with you. What's your perspective in terms of how we're measuring up to the expectation that is being set, the vision that's being set out for this energy transition?
Yes, so thank you very much again. So for me, I think, especially coming from UAE, and I understand their energy transition or energy ambitions more than any other country here. So they are actually quite proactive. So they moved their energy transition targets to 2045, and I was at EDIPEC last week as well. So, and I saw how aggressively and ambitiously they're moving towards a decarbonization agenda as well. So of course it differs from country to country again, but if we see at a whole level, I think specific countries are moving very progressively, and some other countries are perhaps not moving at the same pace. But they are, like I mentioned before, they are steadily moving. So they are implementing processes, they are implementing CCUS, green hydrogen, and other energy carbon emission technologies that would help them to reach energy transition goals as well. So not all countries have been very transparent in their energy transition goals, but at the same time, they are making progressive steps, and of course a lot of these are driven from internal but externally driven as well. So from my perspective, there is steady growth, but again there would need to come more from other countries as well.
And do you see a corresponding aspect of the financial capital meeting these outlooks, these long-term outlooks?
So financial, so in terms of, they are getting a lot of, or inputting a lot of financial as well. So right now, of course, with the oil price being at a high, so they have more capital that they can invest. But again, another benefit of having this decarbonization is that they can have access to cheap debt as well. So that helps them. So now a lot of financial institutions are not lending to especially crude oil or projects like that. So if you have a decarbonization project, you get at I believe 80 to 90 BPS less access to capital as well. So that again helps them to get access to financing as well. So I see that they would not have a problem to, if they are really sincere and they're looking forward to, they would get a lot of capital. And as I said, I have been in this industry now. I see that there's a lot of interest from foreign companies as well. So they are now actually coming. So there's more a pull factor that they want to come in. As you mentioned, that this region has a lot to offer as well. So unlike Europe, and using the competitive advantages of this region, they can benefit as well. So it will be collective benefit for all the partners involved.
All right, since I asked all three of you the same question, I'm just going to go down the line this time. And Lee, you know, I think Kiani talks about long-term ambition and some of the access to the financial resources. Maybe you can build on the general capacity building. I know that, you know, the human capital element's really important here as well.
Yeah, happy to. I also want to just add one thing to our discussion before, right? This region, I think there's a lot of attractive opportunity for hydrogen production. There's been new multi-country visions, like the India, Middle East Economic Corridor to Europe has been laid out, right? I think there is some really interesting long-term visions of how new kind of infrastructure can enable and connect the region with its partners. And I also just want to say that obviously the region was an incredible partner to Europe during the energy crisis, just as the United States was. But I do want to say, you framed up the question about the stock take, so that's really what was intriguing me, because we're here. And I do want to say that, right, I think it's time for us to really confront some of the hard questions around the energy transition. First of all, I think the other day we were conducting an exercise with my colleagues. Okay, what is the world going to look in 2024? We don't know what's going to happen, what the weather will be like in Europe, so that's a big question mark for global fuel demand. We are expecting higher than ever consumption of fossil fuels. We're expecting higher than ever emissions. There's high interest rates, limited fiscal ability in some countries, and there's also a discourse on climate often that is disconnected from energy security and economic security needs, right? So I think these are some of the big questions going in as we're meeting again in the region in just, I think, under 50 days to really discuss how are we going to make progress between now and climate goals and net zero. That being said, I think there has been, as often in the West as a result of industrial policy, but also in India and other places, a lot of project announcements. So as you said, there's a lot of business appetite for manufacturing for next generation technology deployment, but it really depends on what we're talking about, right? So solar and wind have made incredible progress, but when we're thinking steel or aluminum, for example, we have pilot projects or at-scale demonstration projects, but we're not at the scale that we need to be, and the lead times are quite long, and there's a lot of unsolved questions. So I do want to go in with kind of when we're taking stock, I do want to say there are a lot of unresolved questions, and we need to be cautious and we need to be realistic about how we're going to face these questions in a world that is obviously changing at a really, really fast pace.
You know, Lee, we need to keep a degree of optimism, but the thoughtfulness and the deliberate nature in which you're asking to tackle the energy transition, I think, is really prudent. And Dr. Emery, you know, I don't want to bring this purely back to the Middle East, but taking the context here, it strikes me that Riyadh, that the kingdom, is a very interesting venue to have this conversation, not the least because the human capital, you know, the empowerment of the education and the ability of young Saudis to actually be a part of the transition, I think is a really important facet of this transition. And, you know, looking reflectively from the United States, there's a lot of questions about our education system and our ability to produce the bodies needed for this energy transition. I really welcome your thoughts from that capacity building space in terms of, are we actually setting the frameworks for enabling minerals, metals, and materials to be a part of this energy transition, for one? And then two, are we educating people in the right way to make sure that they're thinking about the emissions component along with the security pieces that both you and Lee have now really honed in on?
Right. So I hear actually two interrelated questions. One is like a stock taking relating to emissions, and the other one is critical minerals. Let me stick to the second one for the time being. So there was a recent report released by the Payne Institute, and in one of the slides there, it was making an interesting comparison where it was saying that there are 600 mining students in the United States compared to 1.4 million in China. So the human component there is very, very important because, I mean, we like it or not, innovation is a numbers game. There's a big chance component for anybody who is, you know, has some affinity with statistics. You know that you increase the numbers, the chances work in your favor. Now, in the Saudi context and the GCC context, one of the advantages we have is not that we're not only developing new talent, but we can also pivot our existing talent. I think we're overlooking that, and that's one of the problems with stock taking and categorization. You make a 1 and a 1 and a 2 and 2, but you've missed the 1.5s in between. So this country has a very versatile workforce that has a big oil and gas tradition to it, but that eventually reflects into all aspects of CCUS, green energy, grid management, you know, and then eventually mining, processing, control, advanced forms of control. So labor is an extremely important part of it, and I think that's a emphasized success story that's more yet to become visible even so in the upcoming years. There's a cultural component, as it sounds as a little kumbaya, but I really think I treasure that. I mean, the moment you land in Riyadh, from the first sceneries that you see, you really get that priming, like the subconscious priming of getting ready for a low carbon future. I mean, it goes in all the digital arts, it goes in all the, you know, liveries that you see all around. And I think that really reflects into the everyday discourse, in the you know, media, in everyday arts that people are producing. That may sound a little bit lofty to you, but it really makes a big difference, because when it's time to innovate and to really see things from a different perspective, it's this new generation that'll tell us, you've been doing it wrong the whole time, this is the way to go. So I just want to highlight that human component of that we often miss, stock taking. And with respect to more like capacity and emissions, I mean, the data is out there. Maybe I don't want to recite all this available data, but I think with the circular carbon economy approach, I think we have shown how reusing, not only capturing, but also reusing carbon can really work to everybody's advantage. But one of the one of the fundamental differences that this region, and I think Saudi Arabia, really highlights when it comes to stock taking is that this should be a win-win solution. Mostly technologically agnostic. It's about reducing emissions. It's not favoring a technology per se. But it's also creating win-win situation across different countries, but across different players within each country. So if I may revert back to America's very famous public policy scholar, Theodore Lowy, in 1960, he said something very interesting. Those who suffered through political science are now smiling. He said, sometimes the win is to divide $1 million issue to millions of dollars of issues of nickels and dimes. I think that's what this region has been doing. Instead of making this big $1 million emissions redistributive issue, you're either for it or against it, I think we have started developing an understanding where we divide it into millions of nickel and dime issues, and where we started scoring wins over and over again. And that also made the global elite evolve and really start speaking to each other. And I think that's another approach to global stock taking that we tend to oversee when we look from the West, that this region is producing. So these hydrogen and ammonia shipments to Japan, this India, Saudi talks, a lot of the things that Mazar and others are doing, over in the Emirates, and a lot of other things that are coming about. I think this enlarging the pie rather than dividing a fixed one is a key point that this region has produced to the debate, has contributed to the debate. So I'll just end it there.
We're coming quickly to an end here of the time that we have to cover this topic. I did want to provide you an opportunity, Emre, to talk about digitalization and digital integration. It was an interesting sidebar we had before coming on stage. And I think the audience would benefit from some of your outlooks about how that can embolden collaboration on these topics. And then Lee and Kiani, we're going to come to you both next just to kind of close this out.
Sure. I will keep it very, very simple. Digitalization is not only a renewable energy / critical minerals thing. The kingdom, and as COPSARC, we do a lot of research, but the kingdom also invests a lot in digitalization of oil and gas with a view towards further optimization and reducing emissions or reusing those emissions. But the point I was trying to make more is when you look at how the West is trying to prepare the world for a CBAM future, as I always say, if I may joke about it. Currently, the documents are saying we are not imposing a system, we're ready to play ball as long as everybody's transparent and and products are traceable or carbon is traceable, we're willing to build a regime together. And the kingdom has been investing a lot in digital infrastructure, from state services to every aspect of industry that you can think of. So there's a lot of joint grounds there. There's a lot of mutual benefits there that can really go forth. I think the dialogue has started, and I think as think tankers, as policy pundits or policymakers, I think this is time for us to support that event, support that initiative. That's what I'm going to cut. But if you want to go into details, it's out or they Google, Saudi Arabia's efforts on digitalization, and I will go into detail here. But
Lee, 20 seconds.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the panel. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I think I just want to close out with a few things, right, that I find exciting about this region that I think the West can learn and should be inspired by. Its excellency in project execution and planning. Infrastructure planning will become really, really important, and thinking through what is the demand going to be like in 2050 and kind of working backwards from there. What kind of inputs and products and minerals, mining, metals, everything you need. I think that would be an exercise that would be well served rather than just looking at kind of scenarios that go into the future. And then, human capital. I think there's a lot of educational exchange with the West already, so I think this is something that we should definitely build on in the future and further leverage for the global energy transition. So thanks for everyone for this great conversation.
Yes, and for me as well, so thank you everyone who was here. It was a very delight to have the following speakers with me, and I do, as I've said, that although this region is making steady progress, I do believe that they have the will and the leadership to reach the energy transition targets. This MENA Climate Week, again, is a reflection of the efforts that they're putting. We have the COP28 coming as well, so that would be another great initiative that is being done by this region, and the leading countries in this region are actually making a concerted effort to make sure that they are decarbonizing their operation, and it's just not marketing tool that they can push. And being in this region and inside for a decade now, I've seen the progress that they're making. So I do have very high hopes and believe that they would reach their targets.
Well, thank you all for a vibrant conversation. I think we understand that we're on the cusp of a really transformative time with a new energy system. And Lee, you said it well, with many trade-offs, with incredible new inputs. And you know, I think collaboratively we talked about that having vulnerabilities too that benefit from global collaboration and this region's leadership. So thank you very much. If we can join the audience in just thanking our panelists here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Len.